Have you ever switched your drone's camera into manual mode and immediately become overwhelmed by all the additional settings, such as ISO, shutter speed, and aperture? Well, today we are going to break down what each of these settings does, along with how ND filters fit into the equation, so that by the end of this video, you will understand what all the settings do and how to use manual mode on your drone. Let's jump right in. So let's first take a look at what all the individual settings do, and then how you can use them together to get a properly exposed image. So to switch into manual mode, you want to tap the little auto icon at the bottom right of your controller screen until it says Pro, and now you are in manual mode. And then if you tap the settings on the bottom right of the screen, you will bring up the manual mode settings. So here you will see ISO and shutter, which stands for shutter speed, and you might also see aperture if you have a drone with an adjustable aperture. Now you want to make sure that you uncheck the little auto icon next to each of these so that you get full manual control. And the first setting we are going to look at is the ISO setting. And this is the first setting you will want to set. Now ISO adjusts your camera's sensor's sensitivity to light. So when you increase this number, you're increasing how sensitive that camera sensor is, and therefore your image gets brighter. So you can see as we increase this number, the image is getting brighter and brighter. And if you decrease this number, you decrease that sensor's sensitivity to the light, and so you get a darker image. So you can see as we decrease this number, the image is becoming darker. Now you might think this is great. If I have a dark image, I will just increase that ISO until I get an image that is properly exposed. But increasing the ISO comes with a trade-off. The further you increase that number, the more noise and grain you're going to add to your image. So as an example, here is how an image with 100 ISO looks, 200 ISO, 400 ISO, 800 ISO, 1600 ISO, moving to 3200 ISO, and now 6400 ISO. So you can see as we get to the higher ranges of the ISO settings that there is quite a lot of noise and grain starting to get added to the footage. So for that reason, you want to keep your ISO setting as low as possible at all times. So if you're outside flying on a nice bright sunny day, you're going to want to set this to 100. Now if you're flying in lower light situations, maybe at nighttime, you will need to increase this number, but remember it will come with the trade-off that you are going to start getting noise in your footage. Now just quickly, if you're getting value from this video, please let me know by giving me the thumbs up and clicking that like button down below. And if you love all things drones, but also action cameras, gimbals and more, and want to learn about the best settings to get up and running quickly, along with tips and tricks to help you get more cinematic videos and better looking images with your gear, then please consider subscribing by clicking that subscribe button down below. And when you're down there, be sure to check the notification bell so that you will be alerted when my new videos are released. It would be greatly appreciated. The next setting beneath this is our shutter speed setting. Now when you take an image, the shutter speed determines the amount of time measured in seconds that the camera's shutter remains open, allowing light to reach the image sensor. And this is measured in fractions of a second. So if you see here that it says 1/100, this means that the shutter is open for 1/100th of a second. Now if you increase this number to a higher value, the shutter is going to stay open for less time, and as a consequence, the more you increase this number, the darker your image will get. If you decrease this number, you're telling the shutter speed to stay open for longer, and this is going to allow more light in, and as a consequence, it's going to make your image brighter. But shutter speed controls more than that, because using the shutter speed, you can control how much motion blur you have in your images. Now you might say, why would you want blurry looking images? That sounds like a bad thing. You want your images to be sharp, right? Well, let's take a look at an example. Here is an image I have captured of a car driving along this road, and I've captured it with a high shutter speed. Now, if you look closely, you will see that everything in this image is sharp, not just the car. The background's sharp, the wheels are sharp, and there's no blur on the wheels. So it almost looks as if this car is stationary, which is not what we want. We want it to look like the car is driving along this road. Compare this to the same image captured with a lower shutter speed, and you can now see that although the car is sharp, the background is blurred, the wheels are blurred, and this makes it look as if the car is moving. So when it comes to setting the shutter speed, you will first want to decide if you want motion blur in your images or if you want to freeze the motion in place. Now, if you do want to freeze the motion in place, maybe you're capturing an image of a sporting event or a landscape image with something like water, such as waves in it, and you want to freeze that motion, then you will want to use a higher shutter speed, something like 1/240 or 1/500 or even higher. When it comes to freezing the motion in place, there's no such thing as too high of a shutter speed. Now, if you do want motion blur, maybe like the example we looked at earlier where the background behind the car is blurry to show motion, then you will want to use a lower shutter speed, something around 1/60 or 1/30. If you're capturing a landscape image and there's a waterfall in it or a stream in it, and you want the waterfall to look milky and be able to see the flow of it, then you will want to use an even slower shutter speed, setting it to around half a second or even 1 second. Now here's a top tip. If you're flying the drone and it's in the air and it's a windy day and it's moving around a lot, then you would be better using a higher shutter speed so that it captures that image faster and freezes that motion. Because if you use a slower shutter speed and the shutter stays open for longer, because the drone's moving around quite a lot, you might be able to see the micro jitters in your image. So for those conditions, I would recommend a faster shutter speed. Now the next setting is a setting called Aperture, which controls how much light the camera lens lets in. Now most drones have a fixed aperture, which means you can't change it, but some drones, like the DJI Mavic 3 Pro, have a variable aperture, which means you can change it, and therefore it's useful to know what this setting does and what you should set it to. Now, simply put, in front of the camera lens, there is an opening which the light passes through. And by changing the aperture, you can increase or decrease the size of this opening. If you look closely at a drone which has a variable aperture, while you change the value, you can actually see that opening increasing in size or decreasing in size. Now, the way this is displayed is in f-stops. And if you increase this number, you're actually decreasing the size of that opening, and therefore less light is going to hit the camera, and so the image will get darker. If you decrease this value, it actually increases the size of that opening, letting more light in, and therefore your image will get brighter. Now, with traditional cameras, Aperture also lets you control something called depth of field, and this determines which parts of your image are in focus. And by changing the aperture, you can control that depth of field. So when you decrease the aperture and the opening gets larger, you will get a shallower depth of field, which generally means only the subject you have focused on is sharp and the foreground and background is blurry. And when you increase the aperture setting value so that that opening decreases in size, you will get a deeper depth of field. And this generally means that everything is in focus: the foreground, the subject, and the background. However, because most drones have a wide angle lens and are usually flown high in the air to get landscape shots, Aperture is primarily used for exposure control only, to adjust how bright or how dark your image is, and not for depth of field. Depth of field isn't really a consideration, as you're usually high in the air far away from your subject. So as an example, just take a look at this comparison between two different images taken with a drone at different apertures. The one on the left was taken with the aperture value f2.8 and the one on the right f11. As you can see, they look identical with no depth of field differences due to the reasons I mentioned. And so that is why when using a drone, Aperture is primarily used to control exposure only. So that's how Aperture works, but remember that most drones actually have a fixed aperture. Drones like the Mini 3 Pro and Mini 4 Pro have a fixed aperture that you can't actually change, whereas few drones like the Mavic 3 Pro have a variable aperture that you can change. So how do ND filters fit into all of this? Well, let me give you an example. Let's say it's a bright sunny day and you're out capturing images with your drone and you want to get motion blur. So you have ISO set at 100 to make sure you don't get any noise and grain in your images, and you set the shutter speed to a low value, something like 1/60. But when you look at your controller screen, everything is overexposed. The screen is almost completely white. Well, how can we fix this? Well, we can't increase the ISO because that would just make the image brighter. And if we increase the shutter speed, we will no longer get motion blur. Well, this is where ND filters fit into the equation. ND, which stands for neutral density filters, are quite simply dark pieces of glass that you put in front of your camera's lens to let less light hit the camera. They're essentially sunglasses for your drone. And by placing this dark glass in front of the camera and letting less light hit it, it means we can keep our ISO and shutter speed settings how we like and still get a properly exposed image. Now, ND filters come in different strengths, and this is generally written on the side of the filter itself and is displayed in a number. You might see ND8, ND16, 32 or 64 for example. And the higher the ND number, the darker the piece of glass in the filter and the less light that will allow to hit the camera sensor. So when it comes to finding the right filter to use, what I generally do is make sure I have set my ISO and shutter speed how I like, and then start with the lowest ND value I have. I will place this onto the front of the drone's camera and take a look to see if the image is now properly exposed. If it is, that's great, but if it's still too bright, I will take that filter off and then I will put on the next highest strength ND filter in the range, and I will continue to do this until I find a strength of ND filter that once placed in front of the camera results in a properly exposed image. Now, if you don't have a set of ND filters and would like to pick a set up, the ones shown here that I've been using and absolutely love are from Freewell, and this is the Mega 16 pack, which is great because it contains all the different strengths of ND filters that you could ever possibly need. And I will put a link down below where you can find out more about this set. So how do we put all this into practice when flying on location? Well, the first thing I do is put my drone in the air, and then I set the ISO as low as possible. When it comes to setting the shutter speed, I decide if I want motion blur in my images or if I want to freeze the motion in place. If I want to freeze the motion in place, I'll set a shutter speed of around 1/240 or 1/500. Or if I want motion blur, I'll use a slower shutter speed of around 1/60. Now when we do that, if the image is overexposed or too bright, we have two options. Firstly, if your drone has an adjustable aperture, something like the DJI Mavic 3 Pro, you can start to increase that. And remember, this will start to decrease the size of that opening and let in less light, which will mean that your image starts to get darker. On the other hand, if the variable aperture is already at its highest setting, or instead we're using a drone with a fixed aperture, something like the DJI Mini 4 Pro, then we can use an ND filter to let less light hit that camera, and this will result in our image becoming properly exposed. If, on the other hand, after you have set your ISO and shutter speed, the image is underexposed or too dark, maybe because you're flying in low light at sunset or at nighttime, then we have a few options. If again you have a drone with an adjustable aperture, we can lower this value to make the opening larger, and as a consequence this will let in more light and brighten up the image. On the other hand, if the variable aperture setting is already at its lowest value, or we're flying a drone that has a fixed aperture, then we have a choice. We can either decrease the shutter speed to let in more light, although do be aware this will start to introduce motion blur to your images, or again if the shutter speed is already set quite low, then in this case we do need to start to increase that ISO until we can see our subject. And this is common if we're flying our drone at nighttime. If you are flying your drone at nighttime, you are going to be using higher ISO values. And that's why a lot of the time when you see drone footage online, it does have some noise and grain in the footage. Now I understand that's a ton of information. So to make it easy, I'm going to put a cheat sheet on the screen now, which you can screenshot or reference back to at any time. So you can see across the top, As we increase the ISO, the image will get brighter, but as a consequence of increasing that ISO, there's also going to be more noise and grain. You can see for the shutter speed setting, a lower shutter speed results in a brighter image, and a faster or higher shutter speed results in a darker image. But you can also see that a slower shutter speed has motion blur, and a higher shutter speed will freeze motion in place. Lastly, you can see the aperture, which again will be useful if you do have a drone with a variable aperture that you can control. And you can see that a lower aperture value means the camera's lens opening will be larger, so you will get a brighter image, and a higher aperture value will mean that opening is smaller, resulting in a darker image. And I've left depth of field out of this cheat sheet because again, it doesn't really apply to flying drones. So there you have it. That's basically everything you need to know when it comes to using the manual camera controls on your drone. Now, if you want to learn about some of the mistakes you should avoid when using your drone, then here is a video going over the 12 biggest drone mistakes new pilots make that I highly recommend checking out by clicking up here or by clicking the link in the description down below.